as a tutorial, which means that we're very interested in your questions. But I will talk for a bit, and then we'll just sort of take a break. No, a break. Well, I'll stop talking for a bit, and you all should have questions. Okay, so we're all here. And the first thing I do is I talk about our 18th century Constitution. Everything that happens today and how it happens is traceable one way or another to our 18th century Constitution. I suspect you want to talk about the president, and we will. But remember that presidents come and presidents go, and the 18th century Constitution endures. It is a Constitution that embodies 18th century notions of separation of powers and checks and balances. What I really want to get across, it is as much a constitution about the states as it is the federal government. Remember also that the framers didn't contemplate political parties. They assumed that all the people in government would be men like themselves, born to wealth and privilege with a strong sense of civic duty. But political parties emerged right after the 1796 election. And ever since 1860, there have been two, the Democrats and the Republicans, and there have been 30 presidential elections since 2000. With the Republicans' win in 1916, Republicans have won 16, Democrats have won 14. And with the exception of 1988, after one party has held the presidency for 2 terms, the other party wins it. And that's what happened in 2016. I want to talk about the states. Have you ever considered the meaning of the term United States of America? The first constitutional document in the American constitutional system is not the Constitution. It's the Declaration of Independence, in which it is said these 13 colonies ought to be, and hereby are, free and independent states. And what does that mean? It means that the states are sovereign. Each state has its own system of laws and its own system of courts. Most of the laws we're subject to are Michigan laws and not laws of the federal government. States don't depend on the U.S. Constitution for the source of their power. There is a notion of state sovereignty. Congress has to observe certain limits when it's dealing with the states. One of the things is it cannot commandeer the states to regulate under the federal government. Before the federal government had its data checks in place for gun permits, it required state and local sheriffs and police chiefs to do the background checks. And the Supreme Court said, that's unconstitutional. You can't commandeer, federal government can't commandeer, can't force the states to do things. You can offer them money. And this came up with the Medicaid expansion. The Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional for Congress to make the states agree to the Medicaid expansion under the threat of losing all their Medicaid funds. So today, there are 19 states that aren't participating in the Medicaid expansion. Talk about gun control for a moment. Pretty clear that Congress is not going to enact any gun control laws. But in the wake of the Parkland massacre, Florida enacted new law which bans the A-15 rifle, which requires that people be 21 years old to have a gun permit, and I think improves the background checks. We also see this, the new tax bill eliminated the individual mandate to buy insurance, and there's also an effort for states to offer sort of bare bones policies. Some states are thinking about at least requiring the individual mandate within the states, and to ban these policies, these very bare bones policies within the state. My point is that the states have a lot of power in the American constitutional system. Okay, now come back with me to the summer of 1787. And we have these men who came to the Constitutional Convention. They're men of the states. And they're concerned about state power. And they were afraid that the federal government would supplant the states. So what did they do? They made it very difficult for Congress to enact laws. First, they compromised. Big states, like New York, said, we should have more representatives because we're big. Small states, like Rhode Island, said, well, wait a minute. We're all sovereign states. We're supposed to be equal. They made a compromise. 2 houses. So you have the House of Representatives based on population. California, the largest state, has 55 representatives. Every state gets at least 1. But then when it comes to the Senate, each state gets 2 representatives. So Wyoming, with 600,000 people and 1 representative, gets the same 2 senators as California, with 55 representatives and 39 million people. That is our constitutional system. Note also, there's no notion of a national interest. The members of Congress are supposed to represent the interest of their districts, and the senators, the interest of their states. So what we call the national interest is the sum total of the interests of 435 congressional districts and 50 states. They also made it difficult to enact legislation. Now each house has its own rules. The rules of the Senate allow unlimited debate and require 60 votes to bring most bills to the temple. But certain bills can be passed under what's called a reconciliation procedure. It ties in with the budget. The Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate in order they were going to pass the Affordable Care Act. But Ted Kennedy died, and in a special election, a Republican won, Scott Brown, so the Democrats only had 59 votes in the Senate. They had to use the reconciliation procedure, which means that the current Senate could repeal the Affordable Care Act with 50 votes. But they didn't get the 50 votes, and the Affordable Care Act is not repealed, but the new tax bill passed with 50 votes. So that because of that, some of the provisions expire in 2026. The system then is one where it's difficult to enact legislation, and there has to be a consensus. Because also the framers gave the president the power to veto legislation. It's very difficult to pass it over two-thirds vote over his veto. Now, what happens is you have to have the House and the Senate and the president to agree on legislation, which means you have to compromise. No compromise, no consensus, no legislation. The framers didn't consider gridlock to be a bad thing. They wanted gridlock. and unless there could be a consensus, they didn't want Congress enacting any laws that could possibly preempt state laws. So what have we seen? Well, we've seen the Republican-dominated House and the Republican-dominated Senate agree on the tax bill, which President Trump had signed. So the tax bill is now law, though some of the provisions expire because of the reconciliation. Now, the Democrats wanted big increases in domestic programs. When Obama was president, the Republican Congress wouldn't agree. It was anything just to hold the line. But Trump wanted a big military expansion, and therefore so did the Republicans. Problem is, under the rules of the Senate, it takes 60 votes to pass an appropriations bill. Well, that's where compromise comes in. The Republicans said, we want a lot of money for the military. Democrats said, fine, we want a lot of money for domestic programs. And so you had this enormous increase in military spending and this enormous increase in domestic spending. All the things the Democrats wanted, they got. Now the president was very unhappy, but the president can't veto a bill in part. You got to accept the whole thing or veto it. And he grumbled about it, but he ended up signing it. The result is we're going to have a big increase in domestic spending and a big increase in military spending. Everybody's happy except those who care about the budget deficit. It's sort of like putting it all on your credit card and not worrying about it till sometime in the future. What have I talked about? I've talked about how the system begins with the states and how that's reflected in the way legislation has to be enacted by Congress. Let me ask you all if you have some questions you'd like to ask about that. Yes?
The biggest question I have is that, okay, so you got the Democrats and the Republicans, and then the other people.
But they don't count.
Exactly,
It's the two parties that count.
But didn't they stand for the opposite meanings back in history? Like, didn't you want to be a Republican, but now you want to be a Democrat? Like, when did the rules change?
Okay, very interesting. One of the major factors in our constitutional system has been race. In order to get the agreement of the southern states, the Constitution had to legalize slavery.
Yes.
The Civil War brought an end to it. At that point in time, because the Republicans were the new party that sort of got us through the Civil War, voters in the southern states tended to vote Democratic. That was sort of called the Solid South. The Republican votes varied from state to state. In 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was president and the Democrats controlled both houses, the Senate broke a filibuster, then took 67 votes to enact the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations and employment. In 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King, Congress added housing. Well, when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, he says, we're turning the South over to the Republicans, which very much happened. Southern politics has always been expressly or implicitly tied in with race, and the result is that the South now tends to vote Republican. It varies state by state, but
As a Texan, I wanted to know, because I knew it used to be different, and I didn't understand why it changed, but now it makes sense.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the turning point, which led to the South being heavily Republican today.
Okay.
But of course, there is still a substantial African-American population in many parts of the South, which means that the cities in the South tend to be Democratic, and the states tend to be Republican. And there is conflict between the cities and the states. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. With clarity, too.
Okay. Do you have some other questions about what we've
So
got?
how does the electoral college fit into this?
I want to come to that when we talk about the president. Just one moment. I suspect a lot of you want to talk about the presidency. Yes.
I want to talk about military spending. What does
Okay.
he mean by military spending? Are we spending are we going to war or something? Like, why do we have to increase our military spending if we're not thinking about going to a war or taking
Well,
other
it's
countries?
modernizing weapons, increasing the size of the armed forces.
Is it because to steer other countries just like we did back then with
in the
Russia?
Cold War?
Yeah.
The world
It's like-
over, they spend on military. But there's new weapons are being developed. Existing weapons are being updated.
So just to scare other countries,
Well, they
to
wouldn't put
become
it
more
that.
to become more powerful, like our countries will be more powerful.
You know, we used to say during the days of the Cold War, you could only destroy the world a couple times over with nuclear weapons. But, you know, now they want more sophisticated weapons. Well, we say we don't have a Cold War anymore, but we have terrorism.
Yeah.
Or there's a need, you know, who knows? But the answer is that the Republicans strongly favor military spending, and I guess the Democrat, look, we don't care. You want to spend on the military, fine. We don't care about the deficit. You supposedly do. We care about domestic spending, and that's been increased. It's been increased beyond the levels it was during the Obama administration. Obama could not get those kind of increases with a Democratic president and control the one house of Congress. Now the Democrats can get them with a Republican president and Republican control of both houses of Congress because of the need for compromise.
For domestic spending, do you mean like Medicare or something like that?
Medicare, no. Medicare and Social Security are what we call entitlements. That is, they're prescribed by law. The domestic spending, let me just, more money for scientific research, which will please scientists at the university. I just got a couple of figures here. I mean, increasing Head Start, or grants for child care, or subsidies. The transportation program gets a grant. Mass transit gets a grant. Water and flood control, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the things about domestic spending. Okay, let's talk a bit about the presidency. We say that the American presidency is it's just a unique constitutional concept, unparalleled in the constitutional system of any other democratic nation, where the entire executive power is lodged in one person. It's not like a parliamentary system where members of the cabinet each have an interest. The members of the president's cabinet are simply officers of the United States, chosen by the president. He can hire and fire them at will. I've explained that the framers contemplated a president who would combine the powers of the monarch in Great Britain and the prime minister. The powers are enormous. And of course, the framers were afraid. They knew the first president was going to be George Washington. But what happened? Who was going to come after Washington? Well, they wouldn't trust the people to elect the president. In France, for example, there is direct election of the president. The people go to the polls on one Sunday and vote. Everybody votes. Every vote counts. If nobody gets 50% plus one, they have a runoff the next week between the two highest candidates. Now, we don't do that. The framers did not trust the people with this important task of electing a president. Now, it's true that the only people who could vote were white male property owners, but that would include farmers and artisans. We can't trust the people. But what we will do, because we do believe in democracy, we'll fall back on the states. The states will elect the president through an electoral college. So each state will have votes in the electoral college equal to the number of senators and representatives. So the small states get at least 3. It's like Wyoming. California has 57, or 53, I'm not sure exactly. But in any event, so what the voters in each state would elect these electors. They would be wise men, and they would meet in the state capitol, and they would cast their vote. Whoever got a majority of the votes would become president. And that's the system we still use today. Don't pay any attention to the so-called popular vote. It doesn't count, and it doesn't matter, and it's not accurate. What we call the popular vote is simply the sum total of votes for the sum total of votes for electors for each candidate. We don't know how many Republicans in California or how many Democrats in Texas didn't vote for president because they know their vote wouldn't count. If we had direct election, all the campaigning would be different. They'd be in New York and California and Texas and Florida all the time. Now, they campaign in a limited number of battleground states. So the popular vote doesn't count. For example, Clinton got about 3 million more popular votes than Trump. But she got 4 million more votes in California. Trump got 507 electoral votes. That makes him the president. That's all that counts. So he is a fully legitimate president, and it doesn't matter that he didn't win the so-called popular vote. So interestingly enough, Trump carried 30 states with 307 electoral votes compared to Clinton's 232. 3 traditionally blue states that voted Democrat, including Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, combined gave Trump a majority of only 77,000 votes, 10,000 votes in Michigan. But since we are voting for electors, it's winner take all. And that's how Trump managed to amass his 270 votes and become president. The framers were afraid, what do we get a bad president? How do we remove a bad president? They settled upon a British parliamentary practice, what's called impeachment, where Parliament could impeach, that means call into question the behavior of an official of the crown. And if a majority in Parliament voted him out, the official was prohibited, was kicked out of office. Basically, we do something very similar, but the House has to vote for impeachment. The Senate can convict by a 2/3 vote. Exceedingly rare. Now, way back in 1974, Nixon was told, you're going to lose the Republicans in the Senate. So Nixon resigned. But other than that, and Clinton was, when they impeached Clinton, no one knew that, It was clear there'd never be a majority vote, a two-thirds vote of the Senate. Don't count on their impeaching President Trump. Anything can happen, especially if the Democrats get control of the House, they can impeach him. If the Republicans get control, no matter what, they won't impeach him. Then it's up to the Senate, but don't count on impeachment, it's very rare. Okay, we've talked about the election of the president. We've talked about removal of the president. Let's talk about presidential powers. They are enormous. Now remember, we operate under separation of powers. Congress can pretty much, except for a few powers, Congress can overrule the president. But he appoints all officers of the United States. That means all judges, all cabinet officials, again, subject to confirmation in the Senate. But he appoints the power. He has the power to pardon. It's an absolute power. The courts can't question it. He can pardon everybody connected with the with the Russian election, including himself. So it's an unlimited power to pardon. He recognizes foreign governments, and he alone. Now, President Trump, President Obama recognized Cuba. President Trump has not broken off diplomatic relations with Cuba, but he's cut back on some of the things. President Trump has announced that he's going to locate the Israeli embassy at Israel to Jerusalem. Now that changes the practice of all the past presidents, but that's within his power to do so. It was interesting, if a child is born abroad to American parents, they will register the child in the American consulate. The child is considered an American citizen by birth, because Congress is so provided in statute. So if you're abroad and your child is born, you register the child at the consulate, the child's an American citizen by birth, and is eligible to become president. Well, because we had not recognized the Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the passport for the new American citizen simply read Jerusalem. Now, if this had happened in London, it would have read London, England. So Congress passed a law requiring that the passports issued in Israel, in Jerusalem, read Jerusalem, Israel. Supreme Court said that law is unconstitutional. This is related to recognition of a foreign government. And only the president can decide on recognition. So, President Trump can and likely will decree that where passports are issued in Jerusalem, they read Jerusalem, Israel. The most important power of the president in the domestic context is the power under Article 2, Section 3, quote, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. What that means is when Congress enacts laws, it has to give authority to implement the laws, which it does by statutory standards. Well, the president controls the executive branch, so he decides how the agencies will administer the laws of Congress. In the Obama administration, the Environmental Protection Agency took a very strong stand to prevent global warming. Now that you have a new administration, the Environmental Protection Agency is not going to do that. Changing the Department of the Interior is changing the rules about grazing, about mining and other activities on federal land. The Department of Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the Obama administration would only initiate deportation actions against people with guilty of serious criminal offenses. Now the Trump administration says anybody can be deported. Again, it's a different way to administer the laws. Now, Obama issued an executive order to prevent the deportation of these young dreamers, the young adults who were brought here as children by their parents. Trump repealed the executive order effective March 6th, saying that Congress is going to have to pass a law, and I'll go along with letting them stay in the country, even expanding them to anybody who's eligible, and I'll even open up a path for citizenship. What I want in exchange, I want approval of the border wall, I want elimination of family reunification immigration, I want elimination of the diversity. There's a diversity lottery where people from countries with small totals of immigrants to the United States can get a lottery. And why do the Democrats feel no pressure? The matter's tied up in court. One of the things that we learned is what goes around comes around. Republican attorneys general, come back to the states, sued the Obama administration to challenge executive orders. Democratic attorney generals are suing the Trump administration. Right now, a lower court has ruled that his repeal of the DACA executive order is contrary to law, arbitrary. The case is up on appeal. The Supreme Court has refused to advance it, so Congress has a lot more time to come up with a fix, so to speak. But this is where the president has the most enormous power to change things. It's not so much in legislation, which requires approval of Congress. It is in the administration of all the federal laws. Finally, when it comes to the foreign affairs power, there's no real limitation on the president's power. I mean, he is commander-in-chief. In theory, he's bound by a law of Congress. For example, Congress passed a law providing for new sanctions on Russia. He did not veto that because he knew that the veto would be overruled. The law authorizes him to impose sanctions on Russia, and he's doing so. But if he wants to send troops to the South China Sea to combat China, he can do so. If he wants to bomb North Korea, he can do so. Enormous powers over foreign affairs. Okay, now I have talked a lot. I've given you an overview of the powers of the president, and this is a tutorial, so it is time for you all to come up with some questions about, in this case, about presidential power.
In terms of declaring war,
Right.
remind us of what the president can do and can't do.
He can do anything. I mean, that is to say, the courts will not intervene. We saw that in the Vietnam era. Now, there's certain protocols or conventions that presidents have observed. The last time that Congress met in full session to declare war was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. But Congress authorized the Gulf War and the Iraq War. I use the term authorized. There's a debate over exactly what Congress authorized, but the President Bush claimed, and both President Bushes claimed that this was authorized. where the United States is part of a treaty, the president can act under the treaty and so does not require special legislation from Congress. The Korean War was authorized by the United Nations when the Soviet Union walked out of the Security Council, and the Security Council authorized it. So because the Korean War was carried out pursuant to the UN treaty, there was no need for the president to get approval of Congress. NATO was involved when President Clinton bombed Serbia during the Bosnian conflict. Same thing with bombing of Libya. This is an overview, but it's only a matter of convention. No, there's no way to challenge President Trump if he decides to bomb North Korea or invade North Korea. Enormous power to the president. Elections have consequences. Yes.
So you mentioned if President Trump will bomb North Korea, wouldn't he like have to agree with like United Nations or something like that,
No.
just like Bush did? Because Bush, I remember like it wasn't only the United States who authorized like
Well,
for war in Iraq,
Who's going to make them?
like other countries, right?
How?
Just like NATO. I don't know.
Again, your question is a very good one, but it is a matter of legality. Where the president wants to act pursuant to NATO, the president has to follow the NATO rules. If the president is going to act on his own, he may or may not request authorization from Congress. The courts do not intervene. And so if the president decides, well, we're not really declaring war on North Korea, we're just bombing them for a while so they will give up their nuclear weapons. I mean, they know that's the reality of our situation. It's important that we understand the reality. We understand what are legal constraints, but the courts have never intervened on any question of the president's power as commander-in-chief and Congress's power to declare war.
I don't know about North Korea. Does she does it have any relationship with Russia or something? Or does she
Well,
have allies?
Russia has been a traditional ally of North Korea because they're both communist nations. But Russia isn't all that communist anymore. China is, and China has always had a very close relationship with North Korea. China intervened in the Korean War and basically pushed American troops out of North Korea, which they had invaded. The United States has hoped that China will put some constraints on North Korea. China has done some, and China doesn't want an attack on North Korea because North Koreans would flee across the border into China. But again, the answer is that as far as the United States is concerned, the president has the power to initiate military action against North Korea or anyone else. There's also a notion that the president can take emergency action to protect American lives and property. In 1983, a leftist group was elected to take over the government of Grenada, which is an island in the Caribbean close to Cuba. Grenada is famous for medical schools that take an overflow of American students who can't get the whole Caribbean does. Anyhow, there were American medical students there. They seem to be doing fine. The president said they're in danger. So we sent in Marines to evacuate the American medical students, and just coincidentally, they overthrew the pro-Castro government while they were there. you have to understand the enormous power that the president has both with domestic matters and foreign affairs. Now again, the president can be sued, the president can be challenged. Right now, as I said, his executive order removing the DACA protection has been challenged in court. His travel ban was challenged in court. And you know, what goes around comes around. As I said, Republican attorneys general would go into court to challenge the actions of the Obama administration. Now Democratic attorneys general are going into court to challenge the actions of the Trump administration. Further questions? Yes?
I actually have two questions, but for the sake of time, I'll just ask one. What happens in a case if somebody decides, whoever that is, that the President of the United States is incompetent? You know, there have been people saying that the man is mentally deranged, you know, very narcissistic, et cetera, et cetera. What happens in a case like that?
There is only one way. Only one way.
Yes, sir.
To remove a president. That is by impeachment by the House and conviction by 2/3 of the Senate. The president is immune from criminal prosecution while he is president. This is why when President Nixon resigned, President Ford pardoned him for all the things that he may have done while he was president. As I said, the president has a complete power of pardon. There is a provision in the 25th Amendment for the president to step down temporarily if the president becomes disabled. In certain circumstances, Congress and the Vice President can invoke this, but there's nothing wrong with President Trump. He may be a sociopath, he may be narcissistic, but he's not a psychopath. He's not crazy. He knows what he's doing. There's no better. So the only, as I tell people, learn to live with it. If you're unhappy with President Trump, as people like my wife are, you just learn to live with it. Every day you get some new thing that Trump has done. Get over it. The only way, and we have an election. One of the things in our system, our constitutional system, because the House of Representatives is close to the people, we do a complete election of the House every 2 years. So there could be a wave. The Senate, as you may maybe not know, the framers didn't trust the people to elect the senators. The senators were representatives of the states, and they were chosen by the state legislatures. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment in 2013 that there was popular election of senators. Your second question.
Well, okay, earlier you mentioned, and I think you used it as an example of the president with passports. You know, say for example, a child is born in Jerusalem, Israel,
Right.
to American parents.
Citizen parents.
Yes, sir. Could that child grow up one day and be president of the
Absolutely.
United States?
Absolutely.
Is it also true that so far there's never been a Jewish president of the United States?
That is correct, and only one Catholic president. It was a big issue in 1960. There's never been another Catholic president. John Kerry was Catholic, but he wasn't elected. The presidents have all been Protestant, with the exception of President Kennedy.
Any idea why?
Well, see, this is the thing. After Kennedy was elected, it's no big deal. It's just a coincidence that neither party, no party has nominated a Catholic. One of the things is that when we break down by religions, the various Protestant nominations make up about 50% of the population. Catholics make up about 25%. Jews make up 2%. Muslims less than 1%. So, I mean, it should not be surprising that presidents are the majority of Americans who claim a religious affiliation, heavy majority, are Protestant.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
What do you feel about the I don't know, like the hype or the Illuminati version that all the presidents are connected by some type of bloodline? Do you think that's just talk, or would you just?
It's not a bloodline, but the question is a good one. It is a sense of having been president. Most presidents, when they leave office, do not heavily criticize their predecessor. If you notice, President Obama has only talked about specific issues. Now, the protocol is that the existing president goes light on criticisms of past presidents.
Which he hasn't.
President
Yeah.
Trump is not following this protocol, but that's but these are traditions.
Yeah.
But clearly there is a sense. You know, there were 45 people have been president. That's a very small number in the history of the nation. And it is an enormous job. Why do people want to spend 2 years of their lives or more seeking it? It's all this enormous power. But it is also, I saw President Obama's hair turn gray.
Yeah, I didn't
Now,
want to say that.
maybe that is
Yeah.
due in part to old age, to getting older, but one might suggest that the stresses of the office have something to do with it. Okay, one more question, go ahead.
Thank you for taking this question, because, now, March 6th of this year
Right.
was the 161st anniversary of the Dred Scott decision.
Okay.
It was decided in March 6th, 1857.
Correct.
And in that decision, Judge Roger P. Taney decided that, among other things, that people of African descent were never meant to be citizens under the Constitution of the United States. Now, citizenship is kind of like in the media right now, but my question is as follows, and I'll try to be brief as possible. Back in 1980, Lewis Clayton Jones, he was an international attorney and human rights activist. He was talking in front of the National Bar Association, and he said the following. He said, if one reads the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which is the 14th Amendment, which is, I'll be brief, it says, 14th Amendment, all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And that was ratified on July 9th, 1868. Now, Lewis Clayton Jones says, and so if words do, in fact, have meaning, when used in a logically and grammatically coherent fashion, the question of African citizenship was resolved with the passage of that amendment. Why then, one must ask, did Africans require a 15th Amendment? The 15th Amendment is, of course, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that amendment was ratified in February of 1870. Why would Africans require the 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, not to mention the thousands of lawsuits spanning more than 100 years in which the status of the African as student, voter, worker, and human being had to be debated and decided by one racist Supreme Court after another. He who would argue that the African is a citizen must also defend the position that all the lawsuits and legislations were mere intellectual exercises, and that Alice is still, alas, in Wonderland. That's from his book, 1980, Enough is Enough, a collection of articles and letters and speeches by Lewis Clayton Jones. So I was thinking the citizenship piece was on my mind heavy, in light of the fact that this is the 161st anniversary of the Dred Scott decision, and in light of his argument about if we were citizens because of the 14th and 15th Amendment, why was all this other stuff going on? And why are we still fighting for so-called citizens?
That would take the rest of the afternoon for me to try to explain. The answer lies in what I've called in my writings the social history of racism. It is a long history of discrimination that I trace back to the concept that was in Dred Scott, which is that African people are an inferior class of human beings, not entitled to the same rights as white men, to use Tawny's language in Dred Scott. With the end of with the 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 14th Amendment probably could be interpreted as guaranteeing citizenship, of a right to vote, but it was the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote for African American men. It took the 19th Amendment to guarantee the right to vote for women. And basically the discrimination, governmental and private, continued. And it continues in varying degrees in certain places today. And all the laws and actions were effort to combat the discrimination. But this is what I've called the social history of racism and its consequences. Race matters. Race has always mattered. And this says there has been, as I say, a long history of discrimination against African Americans and other racial ethnic minorities like Hispanics and certainly Native Americans, who have been perceived of as non-white by the white majority. And so the laws and the actions and all of that are necessary to counter at least the present effects of past discrimination. So for those of us who work in that area, this is not surprising at all. On that less than happy note, we can end our colloquium.
Thank you.